Major Ryan Whitaker grabbed the radio from the private's hands and actually laughed into the open channel. "Command wants to send us Echo Zero." He turned to the men around him, making sure every soldier within earshot could hear. "They're scraping the bottom now. Some quiet little girl with a rifle case. That's what they think this firefight deserves." The laughter didn't last long. Neither did his certainty. If you believe real warriors come in unexpected forms, subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The radio crackled at 6:43 in the evening, and what came through the static wasn't a status update or a grid coordinate or a casualty report. It was something worse. It was silence, 3 full seconds of it, before Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Mercer's voice came back on low and stripped of everything that had made it sound commanding 6 hours ago. "Say again, Echo Zero." Nobody responded. The designation floated over the net like a test question no one had studied for. Staff Sergeant Mason Reed pressed himself flat against the wall of what had once been a forward supply cache and was now just a perimeter of broken concrete and exposed rebar. He had been in this position for nearly 4 hours. His left arm had stopped hurting somewhere around hour 2, which he understood medically was not a good sign. The field dressing wrapped around his forearm was dark and stiff. He had not told anyone. There were bigger problems. 3 meters to his left, Private First Class Danny Torres was working through the last of his secondary magazine with the mechanical discipline of a man who had already decided to make every round count. Torres was 19 years old. He had deployed 9 weeks ago. He had not expected it to look like this. "How many left?" Reed called over. 14, Torres called back. "In the mag or total?" A pause. "Total, Sergeant." Reed absorbed that without comment. Around them, the sound of the firefight was not the concentrated directional exchange that training scenarios had described. It was everywhere and nowhere suppressive bursts from the ridge that came in rotating intervals perfectly spaced, which told Reed something the officers in the command post 300 meters back had apparently not figured out yet. The enemy was not panicking. The enemy was pacing. They were managing ammunition. They were waiting for something specific. He keyed his radio. "Actual, this is Reed. I've got a position report for you, and you're not going to like it." Mercer's voice came back instantly. "Send it." The pattern up Ames Ridge isn't random suppression. It's rotational. 3 positions, maybe 4. They're not trying to push us. They're trying to keep us in this pocket. I think there's a 4th element somewhere in the drainage channel to our south, and if they're where I think they are, we've got maybe 20 minutes before they move to close the funnel. There was a longer pause than Reed expected. "Sergeant, we have a UAV feed. Your UAV feed is garbage right now, and you know it. The dust took it down an hour ago. I'm telling you what I'm hearing and what I'm counting. 3 positions, rotating cadence, 4th element to the south. We are being herded, sir. That's not an assessment. That's what's happening." Another pause. Then Mercer's voice quieter. "Copy that, Reed. Hold your position. Hold your position." The 4 words that meant we have no answer for you yet, but we need you to keep bleeding in place while we find one. Reed clicked off and looked back at Torres, who was watching him with the expression young soldiers get when they've stopped trying to hide the fact that they're scared and have decided to trust the person next to them completely instead. "We good?" Torres asked. "We're working on it," Reed said. At the command post, Mercer was standing over a map table that had become nearly useless. 3 of his radios were down. His air support window had closed 40 minutes ago when the coordination frequency got jammed. His 2 designated sniper assets, both of them experienced, both of them men he trusted, were out of the fight. Sergeant First Class Hooper had taken a ricochet to the shoulder at the 2nd hour mark. Specialist Ewan had burned through his position when an enemy observer spotted his muzzle flash and redirected suppression onto him within seconds. Ewan was alive but relocated, and in the process of relocating, had lost his primary optic. He was now effectively a rifleman, which meant that somewhere in the last hour, someone at the battalion level, possibly higher, had made a request, and now that request had a name attached to it. Echo Zero. Major Ryan Whitaker, Mercer's executive officer, was 41 years old, had deployed 4 times, and had the particular brand of confidence that comes from being good at most things and being told so. He was not a bad officer. He was not a cruel man, but he was at his core a man who organized the world around patterns, that had proven reliable. And the pattern he had built his professional life on was this: in a firefight at the point of maximum stress, the person you wanted was the person who had already proven themselves in exactly this kind of situation. Someone with a visible record, someone with a history you could read and point to, someone whose reputation preceded them into the room. He had never heard of Echo Zero. He said as much to Mercer when the battalion net relayed the designation. "Who is that?" Whitaker demanded. "What unit? What MOS? What's their record?" The battalion liaison, a young captain named Flores, who had driven 2 hours on a nearly impassable road to reach them, checked his tablet and looked up with an expression that suggested the information he had found was less than satisfying. "The file is classified at a level I don't have clearance for. All I have is a call sign and a status en route." "En route," Whitaker repeated. "Yes, sir. We are 40 minutes from losing another element if we don't break this engagement. We have a platoon pinned down 2 snipers out of the fight, communications fragmented, and the battalion's answer is to send us someone we've never heard of who is currently en route." Flores said nothing. Whitaker turned to Mercer. "Colonel, with respect, this is not the time for—" "Ryan?" Mercer's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "Set it up. When Echo Zero arrives, I want to know immediately." Whitaker pressed his mouth into a line and turned away. She arrived at 6:58. The Humvee came in from the western approach with its lights off, which struck the 2 soldiers on perimeter watch as either tactically correct or suicidal, depending on how you felt about driving without headlights in deteriorating light. It stopped 30 meters short of the command post and the passenger door opened. Private Kellerman, who was 17 months into his service and had seen a fair amount by that point, said afterward that his first reaction was confusion. Not because she was a woman he'd served alongside women and didn't have opinions about that. His confusion was simpler. She was quiet, not quiet like someone trying to avoid attention, quiet like someone who was paying attention to things other people hadn't noticed yet. She stepped out of the Humvee, reached back in for a hardened rifle case, and then stood for a moment that lasted maybe 8 seconds, just listening to the pattern of fire coming from the ridge. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look excited. She looked the way a surgeon looks when they're reviewing a problem before deciding where to cut. Kellerman keyed his radio. "Command Echo Zero is on site." Whitaker was there in under 2 minutes. He was a large man, not in a way that was ever relevant until a moment like this, when his physical certainty seemed to become part of his argument. He looked at her once quickly, and then at the rifle case, and then back at her face. "Captain," he said, because Flores had finally located that much in the file. "Captain Carter," she said, Lila Carter. "Captain Carter, I'm Major Whitaker XO. I'm going to be straight with you about our situation." "Please," she said. We have a platoon pinned in a forward pocket approximately 300 meters at your 2 o'clock. We have enemy fire coming from at least 3 positions on the ridge to the north. We have lost 2 sniper assets, communications are partial, and air support is unavailable for the foreseeable future." He paused. "With that picture in mind, I want to understand what specifically you bring to this engagement that justifies the resource of extracting you from wherever you were and delivering you here." She looked at him, then she looked at the ridge, then she looked back at him. "Can I hear the radio traffic from the last 30 minutes?" she asked. Whitaker blinked. "Excuse me, the radio logs, or a summary if you don't have recordings. I want to hear what your platoon has been reporting, not the official sit-reps, the actual traffic. What your people on the ground have been saying." "Captain, I don't think you understand the urgency." "I understand the urgency," she said, and her voice didn't change, didn't sharpen, didn't rise. It was a simple statement of fact, patient and completely unmovable. "That's exactly why I want the radio traffic first. I can't read the geometry of this engagement without knowing what your platoon has already observed. They've been inside it for 6 hours. They've seen things your command post hasn't." She paused. 30 minutes, can I have them?" Whitaker looked at her for a moment that went on slightly too long. Then he turned and pointed at Flores. "Pull the logs." She listened to the logs for 11 minutes. She didn't ask questions. She didn't make notes. She stood with the small speaker close to her ear and listened the way people listen to music they already know, following something underneath the surface, tracking a pattern that wasn't in the recording but was implied by it. When it was done, she set the speaker down and turned to Mercer, who had come up quietly during the playback and was watching her with the particular expression of a man who has run out of good options and is now evaluating a new one with everything he has. 3 firing positions on the ridge, she said. Rotating cadence, approximately 4-minute intervals per position. Your platoon sergeant called it correctly their pacing. But there's a 4th element, and it's not just in the drainage channel. They've got an observer somewhere elevated and slightly off the main ridge axis, not obvious. Something your UAV would have missed, even with clean feed. Mercer was very still. How do you get that? Your specialist Ewan lost his position 2 hours in. He said the suppression came onto him within seconds of his muzzle flash. That's too fast for someone on the ridge, wrong angle, wrong response time. There's someone else, somewhere with a lateral sight line to your entire forward position. She picked up the rifle case. I need the highest point within 200 meters of here that still has a concealed approach. Whitaker said it before he could stop himself. There's a broken observation tower 60 meters north, but it's exposed on 3 sides and the structure is compromised. We don't use it, she nodded. I do. Captain, Major. She said it without hostility, but with the precise weight of someone who had answered this particular objection many times and was not interested in answering it again. I heard everything you told me when you briefed me on this situation. I understand what you think the problems are. I need you to trust that I also understand things that aren't in that briefing. She looked at Mercer. Colonel, I need silence on the command net for the next 10 minutes. Not radio discipline, actual silence. If someone fires at me, I need to be able to hear what shifts in the enemy pattern before I respond. Can you give me that? You? Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the ridge. Then he nodded. Ryan, he said quietly. Whitaker pressed his teeth together. Net goes quiet, he said into his radio. All elements command net silent. Execute. She picked up the rifle case and walked north. Nobody spoke. Reed heard the net go quiet and felt his stomach drop. Sergeant, Torres said, I heard it. What does it mean when they go silent? It means something's happening, Reed said. He pressed his back against the concrete and scanned the drainage channel to the south. The light was almost gone now. In another 15 minutes, the engagement would move into a phase where the terrain advantages shifted completely, and Reed did not want to think about what that looked like for his position. Then Corporal Weiss, 3 meters to his right, said very quietly, Sergeant, ridge, left position. Reed turned. At the left firing position on the ridge, there had been a shooter operating on a 4-minute cycle. Reed had counted it. 2 minutes ago, they had fired. They were not due for another 2 minutes. But they were moving. Something spooked them, Weiss said. Something got their attention, Reed corrected. There's a difference. He keyed his radio, remembered the silence order, and released the key. Whatever was happening, it was intentional. Someone had a plan. He didn't know whose plan it was or whether it was going to work. What he knew was that his job right now was to hold count and be ready. Torres, he said, Sergeant, when something breaks, it's going to break fast. You ready? Torres checked his magazine. 14 rounds total. He looked up. Yeah, he said, I'm ready. The tower was a skeleton. 2 of the original 4 walls were partially standing. The floor at the top level had buckled at one corner, creating a lean that made every movement on it a deliberate calculation. The iron rungs of the internal ladder had rusted to a color that suggested they would hold under normal conditions and fail under stress, which meant she climbed them with her weight distributed across 3 points at all times, the rifle case slung across her back, moving without sound. At the top, she took 40 seconds. She did not set up the rifle. She did not even open the case. She simply let her eyes work across the ridgeline in the dying light, tracing the terrain the way you trace a sentence when you are looking for the word that changes the meaning of everything around it. She found the observer in 90 seconds. Not a position on the ridge. Lateral. Exactly as she'd said, a drainage fold that ran perpendicular to the main channel, something that wouldn't appear significant on a 2-dimensional map, but created a perfect elevated vantage point into the entire forward area. The observer wasn't visible directly, but the geometry gave it away. She had seen this configuration before in a different country, in a different desert, and she recognized it the way you recognize a voice before you see the face. She opened the case. The rifle came out in components and went together in under 40 seconds. She did not rush. Rushing changes breathing. Breathing changed everything downstream. She settled, adjusted her position twice, and pressed the key on the small secondary radio clipped to her shoulder. the one set to a frequency that only Mercer had. "Command," she said barely above a whisper. "I have visual confirmation on 4 positions. Ridge left, ridge center, ridge right, and a lateral observer in the perpendicular drainage fold, south-southwest. The observer is the coordinator. Take the observer and the pattern collapses." A pause, requesting confirmation that the net remains silent. Mercer's voice, barely audible, confirmed. "Copy. Do not respond further unless I call for fire support. I'll manage the sequence." She released the key. She settled her cheek against the stock. She breathed once slowly and all the way in, all the way out. And then she became the most dangerous thing on that battlefield, not because of what she was holding, but because of what she understood that no one else had understood yet. The observer was not just coordinating fire. The observer was the timing mechanism for the final push. In 4 minutes, if the pattern held, and she was confident it would, the enemy would initiate their close movement through the drainage channel to the south. They had been building to it for 6 hours. They believed the platoon was sufficiently suppressed, sufficiently low on ammunition, sufficiently disorganized to be overrun. They did not know that the geometry of their own plan had just been read by someone who had been doing exactly this, reading battlefield geometry for 11 years. She exhaled half a breath. Her finger moved. Reed heard the shot and did not immediately understand what had changed. It was a single report distant from the north, from behind the command post. Not from the ridge. The sound of it was different from the ongoing firefight. Heavier, more deliberate. A .50 caliber sound has a particular quality that soldiers who have heard it before can identify immediately, not from the shot itself, but from what comes after it, a half second of absolute silence, while the round reaches its destination, and then nothing. No return fire, no adjustment, just absence where something had been. Then 2 things happened almost simultaneously. The ridge left position went quiet, and Torres said, "Sergeant, the south channel, movement." Reed snapped his head south. Through the dying light, he could see shapes, not many, but moving, and moving wrong. Moving like people who had been coordinated 30 seconds ago and were suddenly unsure whether the coordination was still intact. "That's the push," Reed said. He felt it in his chest before his mind had finished the analysis. "They're coming through the channel. They just lost their observer, and they're pushing anyway because they don't know what happened yet." He grabbed Torres by the shoulder. "Machine gun team, second position. Right now, I need them on that channel approach in 30 seconds. Torres ran. Reed keyed his radio, said 3 words, "Channel south now," and released. From somewhere north, another shot rang out. Then a third, each one separated by exactly the interval of someone who was not hurrying, because hurrying wasn't part of the plan. The ridge positions began to shift to reorient, and in doing so, they did something tactically catastrophic. They broke their pattern. Their coordinated suppression system, thing that had kept Reed's platoon pinned for 4 hours, became confused directional fire as each position tried to identify what was happening to the other positions, which meant the pocket opened. And Reed's platoon, without being told, without a formal order, began to breathe for the first time in hours. "Hold," Reed said loudly enough for the line to hear. "Don't advance. Hold position and cover the channel. Let them come to us." He pressed his back against the concrete. Through the sound of the shifting firefight, through the confusion now audible in the enemy movement south of them, he heard one more shot from the north. Then another. Then silence from the ridge that felt different from all the silences before it. This silence felt like an ending. He looked at Weiss. "Count," he said. Weiss started counting. He got to 40 before he said, "Ridge left," still quiet. He got to 70 before ridge center, quiet. At 90, he said, "Sergeant, I think they're done." Reed let out a breath that he had been holding for 6 hours, a breath that had accumulated everything the day had cost him, the arm, the ammunition, the fear. He hadn't let Torres see the moment 2 hours ago when he genuinely calculated the probability that none of them were walking out of this pocket. "Don't celebrate yet," he said. "Cover the channel." But Torres was already there with the machine gun team, and the movement in the channel was already dissolving enemy elements that had been mid-push, suddenly reversing, suddenly unsure, suddenly uncoordinated in exactly the way that people become uncoordinated when the plan they trusted disappears underneath them. The firefight did not end in a dramatic final confrontation. It ended the way most things end, when someone with genuine understanding takes control of a situation. It simply stopped being a fight. The pieces stopped fitting together for the other side. The coordination evaporated. The geometry, which had been designed to trap and destroy Reed's platoon, turned in on itself and became a liability for the people who built it. Reed sat back against the concrete. Torres slid down beside him. "What just happened?" Torres said. "Somebody understood the battlefield better than they did," Reed said. Torres thought about that. Reed looked north toward the tower he couldn't see from here. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'd like to." At the command post, Whitaker had not spoken in 11 minutes. He had listened to the shots. He had listened to the net traffic as the platoon reported one by one that the suppression was lifting. He had watched Mercer's face go from the controlled tension of a man managing a crisis to something quieter and harder to name relief, maybe mixed with the particular humility that comes from watching someone solve a problem you couldn't. He had seen battles turn. He had seen them turn because of firepower, because of reinforcement, because of an airstrike that arrived at exactly the right moment. He had never seen one turn like this, methodically, structurally, as if someone had reached into the machinery of the enemy's plan and removed the single component that made all the other components work. He thought about what he'd said when the Humvee arrived. He replayed it exactly as it had come out of his mouth, which was a habit he'd developed years ago that he didn't particularly enjoy. The laugh into the radio, some quiet little girl with a rifle case, the certainty he'd felt, not just the certainty that she was the wrong answer, but the ease with which he'd expressed it the way it had come out of him, without friction, without a moment of questioning. He had been wrong before. That wasn't the part that was sitting with him. It was the ease. He turned to Flores. "Get me a line to battalion. I want her full file the moment it's available, whatever clearance it takes." He paused. "And get me her location. I need to talk to her." Flores nodded. Mercer said nothing. He was looking north toward the tower, the same direction Reed was looking from the pocket. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it to himself. But his hands, which had been pressed flat against the map table for the last 2 hours, had finally relaxed. He let out a breath. "Radio," he said. "All elements. Sit rep." The responses came in one after another, positions intact, casualties minimal, ammunition low but holding, channel approach neutralized, ridge positions silent. And from Reed, the last 1-3 words delivered in a voice that was exhausted and steady in equal measure. "We're still here." Mercer closed his eyes for 2 seconds. When he opened them, he was already thinking about what came next. But for those 2 seconds, he let himself feel what the day had almost cost them and what it hadn't. She came down from the tower 14 minutes after the last shot. The rifle was back in its case. Her gear was exactly as it had been when she arrived. She walked back to the command post at the same pace she had walked away from it, and nobody who saw her would have been able to tell from her bearing what she had just done. She found Mercer first. He was standing outside the command post watching her come in. He said, "Captain." She said, "Colonel." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You called 4 positions in under 15 minutes, including 1 our UAV and our entire intelligence picture missed. You sequenced 3 engagements in a pattern that collapsed enemy coordination and redirected their final push into a position we could hold. You did this alone from a compromised structure in low light." He paused. "I need to understand how." She thought about that, not because she didn't have an answer she did, but because she was deciding how much of the answer was worth giving. She chose an honest version. "They weren't trying to destroy your platoon," she said. "Not primarily. They were trying to produce a specific outcome, your platoon in a pocket ammunition expended coordination, broken morale low enough to surrender or withdraw. Everything they did was in service of that outcome. Once you understand the outcome they want, you understand the order in which they need things to happen. And once you understand the order, you understand what to take away from them first." She looked at him steadily. The observer was the clock. Remove the clock and the sequence loses time. Without time, the sequence collapses. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've done this before." "Yes." "More than once." "Yes." He nodded slowly. He didn't ask the next question, the one about where and how often, because he could tell the answer would be classified above what mattered right now. What mattered right now was simpler and more immediate. "My platoon is still in that pocket," he said. "I need to get them out. Can you walk me through the extraction sequence?" She set the rifle case down. "Yes," she said. "Let's start with the drainage channel." Behind them, Whitaker stood at the door of the command post and watched the conversation. He had his arms at his sides. His face was doing something complicated that he wasn't entirely in control of. He had spent his career around warriors. He knew what they looked like. He had a very clear picture in his head, built over 2 decades of what that word meant and what it didn't. He was looking at that picture being revised in real time, and he was honest enough, yet barely to let it happen. He stepped back inside and got to work. The extraction plan took 9 minutes to build and 4 minutes to execute. Carter stood at the map table with Mercer and walked him through it the way a doctor walks a patient through a procedure, not asking for permission, not softening the technical language, but moving at exactly the speed the situation required. She used her finger to trace 3 movement corridors, identified 2 positions where residual enemy elements might still have line of sight, and gave Mercer a sequencing order that was specific enough to be actionable and flexible enough to survive first contact with reality. Mercer listened. He asked 2 questions. She answered both without hesitation. Whitaker stood at the edge of the table and said nothing, which for Whitaker was its own kind of statement. When the extraction order went out over the net, Reed got it and moved within 30 seconds. He pulled Torres up by the collar, got Weiss on his feet, consolidated his element, and started moving through the second corridor. Carter had identified the one that wasn't the obvious route, the one that looked exposed on the map, but was actually shielded by the angle of the ridge. He trusted it because the voice on the radio when Mercer relayed the plan had the quality of someone who had already walked the ground in their head and found it solid. The platoon came out in 11 minutes. No additional casualties. No contact. When the last element cleared the pocket and reached the consolidated position behind the command post, Reed counted heads, confirmed the number, and sat down on the ground with his back against a vehicle and his eyes closed for exactly 15 seconds. Torres sat beside him. Neither of them spoke. It was 7:42 in the evening. The firefight that had started at 12:50 in the afternoon was over. The debrief happened in stages the way debriefs always do, when the situation is complicated enough that no single conversation can contain all of it. The first stage was immediate and practical. Mercer going through the timeline with his element leaders, establishing what had happened in sequence, identifying where the breakdowns had occurred and what they had cost. Reed participated in that debrief with his arm redressed by the platoon medic, a bandage that was cleaner and tighter than the field dressing, but not enough to change the fundamental fact that the wound needed real attention. The medic told him 3 times. He acknowledged it 3 times and did not move. Carter was not in the first debrief. She was somewhere to the north of the command post, and the 2 soldiers Mercer had quietly asked to keep eyes on her reported back at intervals. She was checking the tower structure. She was walking the approach route she had used. She was standing still at a point roughly 40 meters from the tower's base and looking at the ridge in the dark. "What is she doing?" Whitaker asked the second soldier, who came back with a report. "Looking at the ridge, sir, in the dark." "Yes, sir," Whitaker processed that. "Is she on a radio?" "No, sir, she's just looking." Whitaker dismissed the soldier and went back to the map. He had a report to write. He had not yet decided how to write the part that involved Echo 0. Reed found her at 8:19. He had gotten the medic off his back by promising to report to the field surgeon in the morning, which was a promise he intended to keep and also a promise he had made before. He walked north from the command post, following the route she had taken, and found her at the base of the tower, not looking at the ridge anymore, but sitting with her back against the structure's base, the rifle case propped beside her, doing nothing in particular. He stopped a few meters away. "Captain," she looked up. "Sergeant Reed?" He was surprised she knew his name, then remembered that she had listened to 30 minutes of radio traffic that included his transmissions. She had built a picture of every person in this engagement before she climbed that tower. Of course she knew his name. "You called it," he said, "about the channel, about the observer, about all of it." "Your assessment helped," she said. "You called the herding pattern before anyone else. That was the critical piece. If you hadn't put that in the radio traffic, I'd have lost time figuring out what the traffic didn't say." He absorbed that. Most people, when given the opportunity to accept full credit for something, take it. She had just redirected credit toward a staff sergeant she had never met, and she had done it in a way that felt completely matter-of-fact, not gracious, like she was correcting a misattribution in a report. He sat down, not exactly nearby, but not far either. His arm throbbed steadily. "Can I ask you something?" "You can try," she said. The sequence you ran, Ridge left, then the observer, then Ridge center, then the repositioning element. That order specifically. Why that order? She looked at him for a moment. What do you think the reason was? He had thought about it during the extraction. The observer was the coordinator. Take the observer first and you create confusion. But if you take the observer first, the Ridge positions might react by intensifying suppression before they lose coordination, which makes extraction harder, not easier. So you took Ridge left first to reduce the suppression volume by 1, then took the observer while their attention was on figuring out what happened to Ridge left, then took center while they were still disorganized. He paused. That's what I think. She looked at him steadily. That's exactly right. But there was a fourth step, the repositioning element. Yes. You fired on them while they were moving. Mid-movement. Yes. That's not a reactive shot. That's a predictive shot. You knew they were going to move before they moved. Yes. He waited. She let the silence sit for a moment, and then she said, when you remove the coordinator in 2 of the 3 support positions, a forward element has 2 options. Hold and wait for new instructions, or push with what they have before the situation gets worse. That element had been building to a push for 40 minutes. They were committed. They weren't going to hold. She paused. You predict behavior by understanding what someone wants badly enough that they'll do it even when conditions change. Reed thought about that. That's a different way of thinking about a firefight. It's the only way I know how to think about one, she said. There was a quiet that settled between them, not uncomfortable, just real. The sound of the base consolidating around them, vehicles, moving voices, carrying orders in the middle distance. Major Whitaker, Reed said carefully. He gave you a hard time when you arrived. Something moved in her expression that was not quite a smile. He was doing his job. He's responsible for the outcome of this engagement. I was an unknown variable. Skepticism was the correct response. He laughed, Reed said. On the radio, before you got here. She looked at him. I know. Didn't bother you. She considered that question with more seriousness than he expected. Sergeant, I've been Echo Zero for long enough that I've stopped measuring the engagement by how I'm received at the beginning. I measure it by what the situation looks like at the end. She paused. The beginning doesn't matter. The geometry does. Reed nodded slowly. He had served under officers he respected and officers he had learned to work around, and he had spent his career developing a sense for the difference. What he was sensing right now was harder to categorize. It wasn't rank, it wasn't even experience in the way he normally measured experience. It was something closer to clarity, the quality of someone who had thought so precisely about a thing for so long that the thinking had become invisible, had become just the way they moved through the world. Get your arm looked at, she said. He blinked. I'm going in the morning. Tonight, she said. The dressing they put on you in the field was too tight, and you've been compensating in your left shoulder for the last 4 hours. You'll feel it in the morning if you don't get it sorted tonight. He opened his mouth, closed it, stood up. How did you? You held your radio with your right hand the entire debrief. You reached naturally with your left. You've been protecting it without noticing. She picked up the rifle case. Tonight, Sergeant. He walked back toward the command post, and he was almost there before he realized he had followed the instruction without deciding to the way you follow the instruction of someone who has just demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that they understand what's happening around you better than you do. The second stage of the debrief happened at 900 hours the next morning, and it was a different kind of conversation. Mercer had slept 4 hours. Whitaker had slept fewer than that. The circles under his eyes had the particular quality of someone who had spent part of the night doing something other than resting. He had a folder in front of him when the meeting started, not the official after-action material, but something he had compiled himself, pages of notes in his own handwriting, questions and sequences and timings. Carter sat across from both of them. Mercer opened. I want to go through the engagement in detail, not for the report for understanding. There are decisions you made yesterday evening that I've been trying to reconstruct, and I wanted to make sure I have them right. All right, she said. The radio logs. You asked for 30 minutes of traffic before you did anything else. Most assets arriving on site in that situation would request a command briefing first. Why the logs? Because a command briefing tells me what the command post thinks is happening. The logs tell me what the people inside the situation actually experienced. Those two things are often different. The gap between them is usually where the answer is. Mercer wrote something. Whitaker was watching her with an expression that had changed overnight from the controlled skepticism of the previous evening to something more open and considerably more uncomfortable, like a man reassessing a load-bearing wall and finding it isn't where he thought it was. The observer position, Mercer continued. You identified it in under 2 minutes from the tower. My intelligence team had the full UAV feed for 6 hours and missed it. Walk me through what you saw. I didn't see it, she said. I calculated it. Your specialist Ewan reported his muzzle flash drew suppression within seconds. That timing is wrong for any position on the main ridge angle, and distance make it a 10 to 15 second response at minimum. So there was an element with a faster sight line. The only geometry that produces that response time from a covered position is a lateral vantage, something perpendicular to the main axis. The drainage fold was the only feature that gave both cover and the right angle. She paused. I looked at it and confirmed, but the calculation came before the confirmation. Whitaker said for the first time in the meeting, you worked backward from Ewan's report. Yes. He mentioned that detail in a single transmission. It was a status report. I know. You caught something in a single transmission that 6 hours of command review missed. She looked at him directly. Major, your command review was managing a crisis in real time. You were making decisions under pressure with incomplete information and trying to keep people alive. I arrived with no responsibilities except to understand. Those are different cognitive situations. She said it without softening it and without sharpening it. You didn't miss it because you were doing something wrong. You missed it because you were doing too many things at once. Whitaker held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked down at the folder. The final push through the channel, he said. You fired on moving targets in low light at range during an engagement while managing the sequencing of 3 prior shots, and you predicted the movement before it happened. He looked up. I need to understand the level of training that produces that. It's not training, she said. Whitaker waited. Training gives you the mechanical capability. What you're describing is pattern recognition built over a significant number of actual engagements. You can't produce it in a training environment. You can only develop it by being inside enough real situations that the patterns become visible before they manifest. She paused. I've been inside enough real situations. How many? Mercer asked. She looked at him. That's in the file. The file I don't have clearance for. Yes. Mercer nodded, accepting it. Whitaker pressed on. The tower. You chose a compromise structure that we had specifically ruled out. On what basis? The compromise was structural, not tactical. The floor lean meant I had to manage my footing differently. It didn't affect the sight lines. She paused. And it was the last position anyone would expect fire to come from. That matters. When your ridge positions started reacting to my shots, they were looking for a source in the expected places. The tower didn't enter their calculus for at least 90 seconds. That's a long time. Whitaker was quiet. Then, you used our own tactical judgment against them. You chose the position we rejected because we rejected it. Yes? He wrote something in the folder. His writing was tight and precise, and he wrote for longer than the answer required, which suggested he was doing something other than transcribing, processing maybe, or revising something he had written earlier. Reed came in at the end of the formal session, arm properly dressed, shoulders significantly less rigid than the night before. He stood near the door rather than taking a seat, which was his habit in rooms where the people with more rank than him were still speaking. Mercer looked up. Sergeant Reed, come in. He came in. He nodded at Carter. She nodded back. I want your assessment, Mercer said to him. You were inside the engagement for 6 hours before Echo Zero arrived. What changed when she made contact? Reed thought about how to answer that correctly. He had been thinking about it since the night before in the field surgeon's tent, while his arm was being properly cleaned and redressed. The engagement changed character, he said, before we were reacting. Everything we did was in response to what they were doing. We moved to cover, we counted ammunition, we reported positions, we held. The initiative was entirely theirs. He paused. After the first shot from the tower, the initiative stopped being theirs. And the thing is, we didn't feel it shift because of firepower. We felt it shift because the enemy stopped being coordinated. They started reacting to us the way we had been reacting to them. And once that flipped, the whole situation was different. Mercer nodded. That's well put. The drainage push was the clearest example, Reed continued. They committed to that push while they were already disorganized. That's a desperation move. People don't make desperation moves when they're controlling the engagement. They make them when they've lost the thing they were controlling it with. He looked at Carter briefly. She took the thing. Whitaker had stopped writing. He was looking at Reed and then at Carter and then back at his folder. One more question, Mercer said to Carter. The silence order. You asked for absolute silence on the command net for 10 minutes. Why was that operationally necessary? Because I needed to hear what changed in the enemy pattern after each shot, she said. When you take a position, the remaining positions respond. How they respond, how quickly, in what direction, at what volume, tells you the state of their communication and coordination. That's real-time intelligence that you can't get from a static assessment, but you can only hear it if the net is quiet. She paused. The silence wasn't for my concentration. It was data collection. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Captain, in 23 years of service, I have never been in an engagement where a single asset, one person, one rifle changed the outcome of a 6-hour crisis in 11 minutes. I want to be honest with you about that because I think it warrants honesty. She waited. I also want to be honest about something else. When you arrived, I gave you access to the logs, and I ordered the net silent because I had run out of better options and not because I had genuine confidence in your approach. He paused. I'd like to correct that record for what it's worth. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Colonel, you made a decision under pressure with an unknown variable and it worked out. I'd take that over the alternative. The alternative being making the same decision with a known variable and losing your platoon. The room was quiet. Whitaker put his pen down. He had said less in this debrief than in any professional conversation Reed could remember him participating in. He looked like a man who had arrived somewhere unexpected and was still determining the coordinates. The third stage arrived without announcement at 1400 hours in the form of a vehicle that was not standard issue and a colonel who stepped out of it with the particular bearing of someone who had not traveled this far to be impressed by what they were going to find. Colonel James Redfield was 53 years old, had served in more theaters than most officers. His rank had been briefed on and had the eyes of a man who had made enough consequential decisions that he had stopped being afraid of the next one. He walked into the command post, shook Mercer's hand, nodded at Whitaker, and looked around the room until he found Carter. Captain, he said. Colonel, she said, you look the same. You look older, she said. Something moved in Redfield's face that might have been amusement. That's accurate. He turned to Mercer. Colonel Mercer, your report reached the battalion level in the early hours and was escalated to my desk by 0600. I've read it twice. I have questions. Of course, sir. Not for you, Redfield said and turned back to Carter. Walk with me. They walked outside and Whitaker watched them go from the door of the command post with his arms at his sides and his folder under one arm. Reed stood beside him. You know who Redfield is? Whitaker asked, not looking at Reed. I know the name, Reed said carefully. He ran the Classified Operations Division for 2 years before his current posting. If he knows Echo Zero personally, Whitaker stopped, started again. That means she's not just an asset, she's a specific kind of asset. He paused. The kind that doesn't have a file you can read. Reed said nothing. Whitaker looked at him. How's the arm? Better, sir. Good. He looked back at where Redfield and Carter had gone. You know what's bothering me most about yesterday? No, sir. I briefed her on the situation, Whitaker said, and I included every piece of information I had, and in about 15 minutes she built a picture of the engagement that was more accurate and more operationally useful than anything my team produced in 6 hours. He paused, and she built it from the same information I had, the radio logs, the positions, the timing. He turned the folder over in his hands. What does that tell you? Reed considered it, that the information was always there. That the information was always there, Whitaker repeated. We had everything we needed to understand what was happening, and we didn't understand it. He exhaled. I keep thinking about that. I can't stop thinking about it. With respect, sir, Reed said, you were managing a crisis. She was analyzing one. Different jobs. She said something like that. She was right. Whitaker was quiet for a moment. Then, almost to himself, she knew exactly where to look. Outside, away from the command post, Redfield stopped walking and turned to face Carter. He had the manner of someone who had seen her operate before and was not performing surprise, but was performing something else, a kind of careful attention. 11 minutes, he said. The geometry was clear once I heard the traffic, she said. The platoon sergeant had been trying to communicate the herding pattern for 2 hours. No one in the command post acted on it. They were overloaded, she said. They had too many immediate problems to step back far enough to see the structure. You stepped back. That's what I do. Redfield looked at her for a long moment. The battalion report attributes the outcome to superior sniper capability and effective tactical improvisation. He paused. That's not what happened. No, she agreed. What happened was a system-level intervention. You didn't just take targets. You changed the operational logic of the engagement. Yes. The battalion doesn't have a category for that. No, she said again. They don't. He turned and looked in the direction of the ridge. The daylight made it look completely ordinary, a feature of terrain-elevated ground. Nothing that spoke of what it had been 8 hours ago. There's a conversation happening at a level above my current posting, he said carefully, about how assets like you are classified and deployed, about whether the current structure classified, compartmentalized, sent in when there's no other option, is the right structure. She watched him without expression. Some people think, he continued, that what you do should be teachable, that the methodology should be formalized, that we should be building more of you. They're wrong, she said immediately. Redfield raised an eyebrow slightly. Tell me why. Because what I do isn't a methodology. It's a way of thinking that took me 11 years of real engagements to develop, and there are no shortcuts. You can teach the mechanics. You can teach the technical skills. You cannot teach the pattern recognition that comes from surviving enough situations where the pattern was the only thing that kept you alive. She paused. Formalizing it into a training program produces people who know the vocabulary without the grammar. That's more dangerous than people who know neither. Redfield looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not agreement exactly, but recognition. The look of a man who had thought the same thing from a different angle and was glad to hear it confirmed. The conversation will happen anyway, he said. I know. In your position. Same as it's always been, she said. I do the work. Other people decide what to call it. He almost smiled. That's very noble, Captain. Also completely impractical. I've been told, she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said quietly, you held that forward base for 40 hours, last November, alone. She didn't answer. The report on that operation, what I was allowed to read of it, described terrain manipulation, misdirection of 2 enemy waves, and a final engagement where you held the position without reinforcement until extract. He paused. The report called it improvised survival. That's what it was, she said. No, he said. It wasn't. He said it the same way she spoke a simple correction patient without drama. It was exactly what happened here. System-level thinking. Reading the operational logic of the enemy's approach and removing the foundations one at a time. He looked at her steadily. You've been doing this for 11 years, and we've been calling it improvised survival and tactical brilliance and superior instinct. We've never called it what it is. She held his gaze. What would you call it, Nin? Redfield thought about that. The sound of the base operating around them, vehicles, voices the specific rhythm of a post-engagement consolidation. He let it sit for a moment. I'd call it a clearest possible understanding of what a battle actually is, he said. And I'd say we don't have enough people who have it. He turned toward the command post. Come inside. I want to go through the 40-hour operation. All of it, not the report version. She picked up the rifle case. All right, she said. And they walked back in and the door closed behind them. And in the command post, Whitaker looked up and watched Redfield pull a chair to the table with the ease of someone who had been in that room before. Not this specific room, but the specific kind of room where the most important conversation of an operation happens after the operation is over. He looked at Carter. She looked back at him briefly the way you look at someone when you're filing them in the correct category and not the one you started with. He looked away first. The 40-hour operation had a name in the classified file, but Redfield didn't use it. He referred to it the way soldiers refer to things that left marks by what it felt like, not what it was called. He said the November forward base, and everyone in the room who had clearance to know what that meant went quiet in the specific way people go quiet when a subject arrives that they hadn't expected to face directly. Mercer didn't have that clearance. He sat at the edge of the conversation and listened to the shape of it without the content, the way you listen to a conversation in another language, when you know enough to follow the emotion but not the words. Whitaker had partial clearance, enough to know the operation existed, not enough to know what happened inside it. He sat with his folder closed and his hands flat on the table, and for the first time since Carter had arrived, he looked like a man who had stopped preparing arguments and started paying attention instead. Reed was not in the room. He was outside with his platoon, doing what sergeants do after a firefight, accounting for equipment, writing preliminary reports, checking on his people. Torres had not slept. Weiss had a bruised rib from a fall in the pocket that he hadn't mentioned during the engagement and mentioned now because the medic found it anyway. Reed sat with both of them for a while before doing anything else because that was the order of operations. He believed in people first, then paperwork. Inside the command post, Redfield put a single sheet of paper on the table, not from a file from his inside pocket folded twice. He unfolded it and set it face up in front of Carter. She looked at it without touching it. "That's the casualty count for the November base," Redfield said. "Enemy side, attributed to the operation." Mercer could see numbers on the page from where he was sitting. He couldn't read them clearly, but there were more digits than he expected. "The friendly casualty count for the same operation," Redfield said, "is 1 non-fatal. That was you." Carter said nothing. The after-action report described the outcome as the result of a combination of defensive positioning, terrain advantage, and, quote, exceptional individual performance. He paused. "What I want to understand, and what the report doesn't actually explain, is how one person holds a forward base against 2 coordinated enemy waves for 40 hours without reinforcement and produces that result." The room was very quiet. Carter picked up the paper. She looked at it for a moment, then she set it back down. "They wanted the base," she said, "not to destroy it, to take it. There's a difference." She looked at Redfield. "If they wanted to destroy it, they would have mortared it from distance and walked away. They didn't. They wanted it intact, which meant they needed to move through it, which meant they had to come in on foot, which meant I knew the approach vectors before the first element moved." "How many approach vectors?" Whitaker asked, and then seemed slightly surprised that he had asked. Carter looked at him. 3 primary, 1 secondary that they didn't use until the second wave. The secondary was the one that almost worked. "Almost," Redfield said. "Almost," she confirmed. "They shifted to it at hour 31. I had prepared for it at hour 4. The preparation held." Mercer said quietly, "What does preparation look like for a scenario like that? 1 person, 1 base, 40 hours. She thought about how to answer that, not because she was reluctant, but because the honest answer required a kind of precision that she usually didn't need to articulate. She lived inside the thinking. Explaining it to someone outside it was a different exercise. "You don't defend a position," she said finally. "You make the position irrelevant. If they're moving toward you, you're already in the wrong mindset. The question isn't how to hold the ground, it's how to make the ground work against them. Terrain, timing, expectation." She paused. "I spent the first 6 hours not defending. I spent them building a picture of what they wanted and where they would come from to get it. Then I spent the next 34 hours making sure every approach they tried was already a problem before they committed to it." "Misdirection," Whitaker said. "Geometry," she said. "Misdirection implies deception as the primary tool. This was positioning, making sure that every route they might choose already had a consequence built into it that they couldn't see from their vantage point." She looked at the paper again. "The first wave came through the northern approach at hour 8. They committed 12 elements. They lost contact with the lead element at the drainage crossing. I had spent 3 hours rerouting the drainage to make that crossing a specific kind of problem. By the time the follow elements understood what happened to the lead, they had already moved into a position that gave me the angles I needed." She stopped. "I'm not going to describe what happened next. No one asked her to. The second wave was smarter," she said. "They had learned from the first wave. They changed their approach axis, they sent scouts ahead, they moved slower. At hour 26, I thought they might actually have me. She said it with the same flat tone she used for everything else, but something underneath the flatness shifted slightly, something that had the quality of a real memory rather than a professional report. They came within 40 meters of the primary position. I had 3 rounds left for the system I was running at that point. I used 2 of them. And the third, Mercer asked. I still have it, she said. The room absorbed that. Redfield leaned back. The report attributes the second wave's failure to a, quote, catastrophic loss of command elements during the approach. He looked at her. You took the command elements, in sequence, while they were moving, in the dark, at hour 26 of a 40-hour operation. Yes. After 26 hours without reinforcement, without resupply, with 1 non-fatal wound. Yes. Whitaker was looking at the table. His jaw was working slightly, the way it works when someone is processing something that doesn't fit cleanly into any existing category. Captain, he said, and his voice had changed. Not dramatically, Whitaker was not a man given to dramatic shifts in register, but the edge had come out of it. The professional skepticism had been replaced by something more careful and more honest. I owe you an apology. Carter looked at him. What I said on the radio before you arrived. What I said to the men. He didn't elaborate. He had already said it was an apology. Repeating the words he was apologizing for would have defeated the purpose. It was unprofessional, and it was wrong, and I want to say that directly. She looked at him for a moment. Then, Major, if you'd been right, if I had been what you assumed I was, your skepticism would have been the correct response. You were protecting your platoon. That's your job. She paused. The apology I'll accept. The self-recrimination I'd suggest you redirect somewhere useful. Whitaker looked at her. Something in his face that had been held tight for the last 18 hours finally released slightly. Not relief, something more complicated than relief. Like a man who had been carrying a weight and had just been told he could set it down without dropping it. Redirect it where, he said, toward understanding what you didn't see and why, she said. That's worth more than the apology. Redfield was watching this exchange with the attention of someone who had expected it and was noting its exact shape. At 15:20, a second vehicle arrived at the base, and what came out of it was not a person, but a set of documents in a sealed courier case that went directly to Mercer. He opened it at the map table, read the first page, and called Whitaker over without looking up. Whitaker read over his shoulder. His face changed. He looked across the room at Carter, who was at the far end of the table reviewing something with Redfield. Colonel, Whitaker said carefully, this is an operational order. Mercer nodded. For tonight. Mercer nodded again. They're sending her back in. Mercer closed the folder. He walked to where Redfield and Carter were and set it on the table between them. Redfield looked at it. He did not look surprised. Carter looked at it, then looked at Redfield. You knew, she said. I knew it was possible, he said. The situation that generated the Echo Zero request yesterday was one part of a larger pattern. The battalion has been tracking coordinated enemy movement in 3 sectors. What happened on that ridge was not an isolated engagement. It was a test, Carter said. It was not a question. Not deliberately, but yes, in effect. The coordinated pattern across 3 sectors suggests a unified operational structure. Last night's engagement gave us a confirmed read on their tactical methodology, which means someone now knows how they think, Mercer said. Yes, Redfield said, and that someone is in this room. Carter pulled the folder toward her and opened it. She read the first page, the second, the third. Her face did not change, but her breathing did not faster, just more deliberate. The way breathing changes when you're calculating, not when you're afraid. The secondary sector, she said. Eastern approach. They have already positioned. We believe so, Redfield said. If their methodology is consistent with last night's engagement, they've been positioning for longer than the intelligence suggests. The coordination pattern doesn't build in 48 hours. It builds in weeks. She turned to page 4. What is the friendly element in the eastern sector? 2 squads, Mercer said. Light infantry, no dedicated sniper assets. Ammunition status. Mercer checked a note. Adequate for a standard engagement, not for a sustained coordinated assault. Communications. Full. No jamming reported as of 1400. That'll change, she said. The jamming isn't a resource limitation. It's a tactical step. They use it to fragment coordination before the push. They'll initiate it within, she looked at the page again at a timestamp, 2 hours of committing to the approach, possibly less. Whitaker said, "How do you know they'll use the same methodology?" "I don't know," she said. "I think it's highly probable based on the pattern, but I won't know until I'm in position and listening." She closed the folder. "I need the radio traffic from the eastern sector for the last 6 hours. Same as yesterday." "Already pulled," Redfield said, and produced a tablet from the case beside him. She took it. She sat down. She put in an earpiece and began to listen. Nobody spoke. Torres came in from outside at 1541, looking for Reed stopped when he felt the quality of the silence in the room, took in the scene and backed quietly out the way he'd come. He found Reed outside and said, "Something's happening in the command post." Reed looked toward the door. "Big something or small something?" "The colonel who arrived this afternoon has a tactical order," Torres said, "and she's listening to radio logs again." Reed was quiet for a moment. His arm was dressed properly now, properly rested, and the shoulder had loosened up since the night before. He looked at the eastern horizon. "How far is the eastern sector?" he said. "I'd have to check the map," Torres said. "Check it," Reed said. "Haunt." At 16:15, Carter pulled out the earpiece and set the tablet on the table. "Two things," she said. "First, the eastern sector element has been reporting inconsistent enemy probe activity for the last 4 hours. Small scale, not committed. They interpreted it as harassment. It isn't. It's measurement. They're testing the response time and the reaction pattern of the friendly element, mapping the habits." She paused. "Second, there is a transmission at hour -3 that is almost word for word identical in structure to a transmission from the Ridge engagement yesterday. Same interval pattern, same sequence of probe to withdrawal. The same hand is running both operations." Redfield sat forward. "You're sure, I'm confident, not certain, but confident enough." She looked at Mercer. "The friendly element in the eastern sector is going to face the same structure we faced yesterday. The herding pattern, the lateral observer, the coordinated push through a specific approach. They will not recognize it as a structure until they're already inside it. Unless someone tells them," Whitaker said. She looked at him. "Can you brief their element commander," he said, "before you go in? Give them the pattern to watch for. Give them the radio traffic signature so they know what the probe phase looks like." He paused. "So they're not 6 hours in before someone understands what's happening." She looked at him for a moment, not a long moment, but long enough that Mercer noticed it and Redfield noticed it. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly the right call." Whitaker held her gaze. "I'm learning to look at the right things," he said. He said it simply without performance. Carter nodded. "I'll draft the brief. 15 minutes. She pulled a notepad toward her and started writing in a hand that was fast and precise, the handwriting of someone who has written field documents under time pressure so many times that speed and clarity had become the same thing. Mercer watched her write. He thought about what Redfield had said the night before, that the battalion didn't have a category for what she did. He thought about that phrase, system-level intervention. He thought about the 11 minutes between her first shot and the last sound from the ridge. He thought about what those 11 minutes had looked like from inside the pocket, Reed's voice on the radio, calm, but stripped to the bone, counting the silence on the ridge and deciding to believe it. He thought we almost lost that platoon. We were 40 minutes from a catastrophic outcome, and the thing that prevented it was not reinforcement, not air power, not a change in the tactical situation. It was one person arriving with a clearer picture than anyone else had. He thought, what does it mean that we have someone like that, and she is classified and compartmentalized and sent in only when there is no other option? He didn't have an answer to that yet, but the question sat in him with a weight that told him it wasn't going away. At 16:40, Carter finished the brief and handed it to Redfield. He read it, made one notation, handed it back. She incorporated the notation without comment. Mercer got the Eastern Sector Element Commander on a secure line at 16:52. His name was Captain Ortega, and he had the voice of someone who was managing controlled alertness, the particular tone of a commander in the probe phase, not yet committed, but aware that commitment was coming. "Captain Ortega," Mercer said, "I'm going to put someone on this line. I need you to listen to her completely. Do not interrupt, do not skip ahead, and do not assign probability to what she's describing based on what your current intelligence picture says. Your intelligence picture is incomplete. Hers is better. A pause from Ortega. Colonel, with respect, who am I talking to? Someone who was inside a structurally identical engagement 12 hours ago and ended it in 11 minutes, Mercer said. That's all you need to know right now. He passed the line to Carter. She spent 8 minutes with Ortega. She described the probe pattern, what to listen for in the timing, what the withdrawal intervals meant when the lateral observer would be positioned, and where to look. She told him what the radio traffic would sound like in the final 30 minutes before the push, and she told him that when communications started degrading, the push was already committed. She told him one more thing. When you see the pattern, trust it. Don't wait for the textbook confirmation. By the time you have the textbook confirmation, you're already inside the funnel. Ortega was quiet for a moment. Then, how do I know what I'm seeing is the pattern and not something that just looks like it? The probe to withdrawal interval, she said, 4 minutes consistently. If you're seeing 4-minute intervals, you're in the pattern. If the interval varies, it's harassment. 4 minutes is too precise to be random. Another pause. Then Ortega said, copy, I'll watch the intervals. And get your communications redundant before they degrade, she said. Secondary net backup frequencies. Do it now while you still have full capacity. Understood, he said. She handed the line back to Mercer. He closed the call. Whitaker said, will he be able to see it? He'll see the intervals, Carter said. Whether he acts on them is a different question. It depends on how much he trusts information that contradicts his current picture. She picked up the rifle case. That's why I'm going in. Redfield stood. Vehicles ready. I'll ride with you to the handoff point. Reed appeared in the doorway. Nobody had called him. He was just there the way soldiers appear when something is happening that they have decided they need to be present for. Eastern Sector, he said. Mercer looked at him. That's not your operation, Sergeant. No, sir. He looked at Carter. Different terrain than last night. Higher ground to the east, and she said, different ridge geometry. The observer position will be harder to locate. But the pattern is the same. The pattern is the same. He nodded. Then after a moment, you're going to be all right out there. She picked up the case. She looked at him with an expression that was steady and real and completely without performance. The look of someone who has been asked a question by someone who actually wanted to know the answer. I'm going to be accurate out there, she said. That's the same thing. Reed held her gaze for a second. Then he stepped aside from the door. She walked out. Redfield followed. The vehicle started. Whitaker came to stand beside Reed at the door. They watched the vehicle pull away into the late afternoon. She's going to do it again. Reed said, not questioner. Yes, Whitaker said. Different base, same enemy, harder geometry. Yes, Reed was quiet. Then, last night she told me she measures an engagement by what it looks like at the end, not the beginning. Whitaker turned to look at him. She told you that? Yes, sir. Whitaker faced forward again. The vehicle was gone. The sound of it faded into the distance, and the base settled back into its own sounds, the sounds of a unit that had survived something and was now waiting to understand what came next. What do you think it looks like at the end? Whitaker said. The Eastern Sector. Reed thought about the 11 minutes the night before, the silence from the ridge, the drainage push dissolving. Torres with 14 rounds and the machine gun team repositioned exactly where they needed to be. I think it looks like 11 minutes, he said. Again. Whitaker said nothing for a long time. Then he went back inside, picked up the radio, and requested the Eastern Sector communications feed on the command net. He was going to watch the intervals. He was going to learn to look at the right things. The vehicle reached the handoff point at 1738. She got out alone. Redfield stayed in the vehicle. He had said what he needed to say, all of it, both the operational pieces and the other pieces, the ones about the conversation happening above his current posting, the ones about the 40-hour report and what it really described. He had said enough. She slung the rifle case. Carter, he said through the window. She looked back. The third round, he said, the one you still have from November. She waited. You saved it for a reason. She didn't answer immediately. The late afternoon was quiet around them. The Eastern Sector was 8 kilometers out. Somewhere between here and there, a lateral observer was finding a position that she hadn't yet identified. Somewhere between here and there, an enemy element was measuring intervals and building a picture they believed was invisible. They were wrong about the invisible part. I saved it, she said, because walking out of a 40-hour operation with ammunition remaining means you understood the engagement well enough to never need the last round. She paused. That's the standard I hold myself to. Redfield looked at her. Never need the last round, he said. There, she said. She turned and walked east into the terrain, into the geometry that was already forming in her mind. Ridgelines and drainage angles in the 4-minute interval that would confirm everything. She walked without looking back because looking back was not part of the calculation. The vehicle sat still. Redfield watched her until she was gone. Then he said very quietly to no one in particular, God help anyone who underestimates her twice. He told the driver to turn around. The Eastern Sector Command Post was a repurposed forward supply station that Captain Ortega had held for 11 days without incident, which was the kind of statistic that made a commander either confident or complacent. And Ortega had spent those 11 days working very hard to stay on the right side of that line. He was 37 years old, had deployed 3 times, and had the particular metabolism of a man who slept light and thought fast, the kind of officer who did his best work when the situation was moving faster than the briefing said it would. He had received Carter's call at 16:52 and had spent the 45 minutes since then doing exactly what she told him to do, getting his communications redundant, pulling his secondary net online and watching the probe intervals. The first interval he measured was 3 minutes and 50 seconds. The second was 4 minutes and 3 seconds. He called his radio operator, a specialist named Garza, who had excellent instincts and the useful habit of not asking unnecessary questions. Garza, the probe activity to the northeast. What's the last 3 withdrawal intervals? Garza checked his log. 3:58, 4:02, 3:56, sir. Ortega stood very still. 4 minutes, consistently. Too precise to be random. He thought about the voice on the phone, not what it had said, but how it had said it. Not predicting. Describing. The way you describe something you've already seen. He got on the radio immediately. All elements, this is actual. We are now in pattern recognition mode. I say again, pattern recognition. Squad leaders, I need a report on every probe contact in the last 4 hours with timestamps. All of it. Send it now. The reports came in over the next 6 minutes. By the time the last one arrived, Ortega had built a picture on the map in front of him. Probe locations marked withdrawal points, marked timing, noted beside each. He looked at the shape of it. The probes were not random. They were measurements, and the measurements had a direction. He got Mercer on the line. Colonel, he said, she was right. 4-minute intervals. They've been measuring our eastern flank for at least 3 hours, maybe longer. He paused. And I think the push is coming from the south, not the northeast where the probes have been heaviest. The probes are a distraction. The south approach is the real axis. At the main command post, Mercer had the eastern sector feed running live. He looked at Whitaker. Whitaker was already nodding. He had been tracking the probe reports as they came in and had drawn the same conclusion 2 minutes before Ortega stated it. Captain Ortega, Mercer said, reposition your machine gun element to the southern approach. Do it quietly and get your squads redistributed before communications degrade. Already moving, sir, Ortega said. One more thing, the brief said the lateral observer would be harder to locate in this terrain. Where do I look? Mercer looked at Whitaker. Whitaker shook his head slightly. They didn't have that answer. Then Reed, who was standing at the back of the command post reviewing the feed because nobody had told him not to, said, higher than you think. The eastern sector has a secondary ridge feature running perpendicular to the main elevation. Most UAV sweeps focus on the main ridge. The secondary is lower, but it's got the lateral angle. Mercer looked at him. I pulled the terrain data this afternoon, Reed said. After she left, I was trying to learn. Mercer put it on the line. Captain Ortega, secondary ridge feature perpendicular to the main elevation to your east. That's where your observer is. A pause from Ortega. Then, I see it on the map. We never prioritized it. She did, Mercer said. Okay. At 17:51, Carter reached a position she had selected from the terrain data before leaving the main command post. She had spent the 8 kilometers of walking doing what she always did when moving to a new engagement, not thinking about the tactical situation as a problem to solve, but letting it settle into the part of her mind that worked below language, below explicit analysis. The part that had been trained over 11 years of real situations to hold a complex picture without forcing it into premature clarity. She was not nervous. She had moved past nervous in her second deployment and had never found her way back to it. What she had instead was a particular quality of alertness. Not the sharp, fragile alertness of fear, but the steady, open alertness of someone waiting for a pattern to confirm itself. She found her position set up in 45 seconds and immediately began to listen. The secondary radio on her shoulder was set to the Eastern Sector command net. She could hear Ortega's traffic comm precise already acting on the brief. That was good. A commander who listened changed the shape of the engagement before it started. She keyed her secondary to Mercer's frequency. Command Echo 0 is in position. Eastern Sector traffic confirms pattern. I'm locating the observer now. Mercer's voice, copy. Ortega is repositioned. He sees the secondary ridge. Tell him not to look directly at the secondary ridge, she said. Look at the ground beneath it. The observer is elevated, but not at the ridge top. They'll be in the fold beneath the crest. Same reason I chose the tower last night. Last place anyone points their optics. She released the key and began her own search. The light was better than it had been the previous evening, still late afternoon, still directional, but enough to work with. She moved her optic in a slow, systematic pattern that was not the obvious pattern, not left to right across the ridgeline, but starting from a point she had calculated geometrically as the minimum exposure position with the required sightline and moving outward from there. She found the observer in 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Not at the secondary ridge crest, in the fold beneath it, exactly as she'd told Ortega. She keyed the radio. Observer located, fold beneath the secondary ridge crest, approximately 40 meters below the top. They're looking directly into Ortega's eastern flank. A pause. Ortega does not have a direct engagement angle from his position. This one is mine. Copy, Mercer said. She settled. She breathed. The pattern from last night moved through her mind, not as memory, but as confirmation. The same hand, the same methodology, the same belief that coordination and observation could compensate for numerical disadvantage. That belief was about to be tested against someone who had read the methodology and understood it from the inside. She checked the time. 17:58. The push would come before 1900. She was confident of that. The light window they needed for the final approach would close after that. And this commander, whoever they were, the person running both engagements, would not commit to a push in full dark against a prepared position. They were precise, not reckless. She had approximately 1 hour. She used the first 20 minutes to do something she rarely had time to do in an active engagement. She thought about the person on the other side, not as a target, as a thinker. Whoever was running this coordinated pattern across 3 sectors had operational intelligence and tactical patience. The probe methodology, 4-minute intervals, mixed directions, weighted toward a false primary axis, was not improvised. It was refined. It had the quality of a technique that had been tested and adjusted over multiple engagements, each one teaching something that fed into the next. This was not a commander who made mistakes out of inexperience. This was a commander who made the same mistake that highly experienced people sometimes make, the mistake of trusting a methodology so completely that you stop accounting for the possibility that someone has read it. She had read it. The question was whether they had read her. And at 18:20, Ortega's communications started degrading. Not completely, not yet, but the secondary net developed static that hadn't been there 30 minutes ago, and one of his squad radios dropped to partial receive. He reported it to Mercer immediately. Colonel, comm degradation on the secondary net. 1 squad radio at partial receive. Timeline. You are in the pattern, Mercer said, which is coming within 40 minutes. Copy. Then after a beat, Colonel, is she in position? She's been in position for 30 minutes, Mercer said. A pause from Ortega. Then, I want my men to know that. Can I tell them? Mercer looked at Whitaker. Whitaker said, tell them. Ortega got on the element net. All stations, this is actual. We have an asset in Overwatch, position eastern approach. The asset is Echo 0. She is in position, and she has located the observer. You will hear shots from the north. Those shots are ours. When you hear them, the engagement geometry will change. Trust the change. Execute your positions. The acknowledgements came back one by one. And in the quality of those acknowledgements, steadier than they would have been 60 seconds earlier, Whitaker heard something he recognized. Not confidence exactly, something more durable than confidence. The specific kind of steadiness that comes from knowing the person watching your back has already proven they are worth being watched by. At the main command post, Reed was standing at the communication station with Garza's counterpart, a specialist named Wiley who was running the Eastern Sector feed. Reed had not asked permission to stand there. He had simply stood there, and no one had moved him. "Comm degradation on their secondary," Wiley said. "I heard it," Reed said. "Pushes close." Within the hour, Reed said, he was watching the probe intervals on the log, and at 18:23 the interval changed. The last probe had come in at 4 minutes exactly. The probe after that came in at 3 minutes and 15 seconds. Reed sat forward. The interval shortened. Wiley looked. 3:15. That's them compressing the pattern because they're moving into the commitment phase. Reed got on the command net. "Colonel Mercer, probe interval has shortened. 3:15 on the last contact. They're committing." Mercer looked at the data. Time, 18:23. "Echo 0, Mercer said on the secondary frequency. "Interval shortened. 3:15. We believe commitment is imminent." Her voice came back immediately. "I see movement on the secondary ridge fold. Observer is repositioning, moving to a forward angle. They're about to go active." A pause shorter than most. "I need the net quiet, now." "Net goes quiet," Mercer said. "All elements command net silent. Execute." Ortega heard the order and felt the silence drop over the channel like a held breath. Around him, his element was in position, machine guns covering the southern approach, squads redistributed to the angles Carter had briefed, communications redundant and logged. He had done everything that could be done from his position. Now he waited. He had waited in firefights before. He had waited through the specific quality of silence that precedes committed enemy movement, and he had never particularly enjoyed it. But this silence felt different from the ones he'd experienced before. In other engagements, the pre-contact silence had always felt like waiting in the dark, everything uncertain, the outcome hanging on factors he couldn't fully control. This silence felt like waiting in position. He thought about the voice on the call, the way it described the methodology not as a threat to counter, but as a pattern to understand. The way it had said, by the time you have textbook confirmation, you're already inside the funnel. Don't wait for textbook confirmation. He watched the southern approach. He counted his breathing. At 18:31, the first shot came from the north. It was a .50 caliber report, the weight of it unmistakable. The sound moving through the air with the specific authority that Ortega had heard only twice before in his career and never forgotten. His element heard it too. He could feel the change in the position, not movement, but a collective tensing that released into a different kind of readiness. The kind that comes from hearing the right sound, from the right direction, at the right moment. Ortega keyed his radio, one click, no words to confirm position hold. His squad leaders clicked back. 1, 2, 3. He waited. The observer went down first. She had waited until the repositioning was complete, until the observer had settled into the forward angle and was actively feeding information to the ground elements below. Taking the observer mid-reposition was tactically cleaner, but she wanted something more specific than clean. She wanted the coordination to collapse at maximum effect, not before the ground elements had committed their direction, but at the exact moment they had committed and before they could adjust. The observer's communications would have transmitted a final position, reading in the 40 seconds before her shot. That reading would have been acted on ground elements, adjusting their approach axis based on the latest observation, which meant that when the observer went down, the ground elements were already moving on information that was no longer being updated. They were committed to an axis. That axis had Ortega's machine guns at the end of it. She took the observer at 18:31. She moved immediately to the main ridgeline, the primary fire support position, two elements that had been maintaining interval suppression on the eastern sector. The first had been in the same location for 40 minutes. Predictable. She took it at 18:33. The second was smarter. It had established an alternate firing position from the one his pattern suggested, a deliberate deviation that told her something important. This element had been briefed to vary their position. Someone on the other side had anticipated that a consistent location was a vulnerability. She spent 90 seconds locating the alternate position. 90 seconds was long, she knew it. She tracked the suppression pattern, backed out the angle, cross-referenced it against the available cover on the ridge, and found the alternate in a position that was tactically sound but had one flaw. It had slightly less concealment than the primary in the specific direction she was looking from. 90 seconds. She took it at 18:35. The ridge went quiet. At 18:36, the ground elements that had been moving on the observer's last reported position reached the southern approach to Ortega's sector and found Ortega's machine guns. Ortega did not order the engagement. He had told his gunners to engage on contact, and they were professionals. The southern approach lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. 4 minutes and 20 seconds of completely one-sided contact because the ground elements were committed to an approach that no longer had fire support, no longer had coordination, no longer had the observer feeding them real-time position data. They were moving on a picture that no longer existed. At 18:41, Ortega's radio operator reported, "Southern approach neutralized. No enemy elements advancing. Ridge positions silent." Ortega said, "Count." The count came back at 18:43, all positions intact. One minor injury, a ricochet graze that was already being treated. No critical casualties. Ortega sat down on a crate and put his hands on his knees and breathed for the first time in what felt like an hour. Garza was watching him from across the room. "We good, sir," Garza said. "We're good," Ortega said. And then, because honesty was the thing he valued most in his officers and tried to model in himself, "We're good," because someone understood what was coming before it came. He got Mercer on the line. "Colonel, Eastern Sector is stabilized. Southern approach neutralized ridge positions, silent friendly casualties minimal." He paused. The asset's methodology, it worked exactly as briefed. The pattern held. The observer was the clock. When the clock went down, the sequence collapsed. Mercer's voice, "Understood, Captain. Good work." "Colonel, what's Echo Zero's status?" A pause. "We're trying to reach her now," Mercer said. At the main command post, the net had come off silence at 18:42. Mercer had immediately tried to raise Carter on the secondary frequency. 1 call, 2, 3. Whitaker watched him. Reed watched him. "Echo Zero, this is command. Report status." Static. "Echo Zero." More static. Reed felt something cold move through him that he recognized as the specific kind of fear that comes not from your own situation, but from the situation of someone whose competence you have assessed and found to be real. It was different from ordinary fear. It had weight to it. "Her position was in the north," Reed said quietly. "The observer she took was on the secondary ridge fold. That's elevated. If the second ridge position had an alternate, she needed time to locate." "I know," Whitaker said. His voice was completely controlled, which was its own kind of statement. Mercer tried the frequency again. "Echo Zero command. Please respond." At 18:47, Carter's voice came through the static clear and entirely unhurried. "Command Echo Zero. 3 positions neutralized. Eastern sector should be stabilized. What's Ortega's status?" The exhale in the command post was not dramatic. It was very quiet. Just a shift in the quality of the air, the way air shifts when something that had been held releases. Mercer closed his eyes for 1 second. Then Eastern sector is stabilized. Ortega reports approach, neutralized casualties, minimal. "Good," she said. The second ridge position varied their location. "I needed 90 seconds to relocate. That's why the response was late." "We noticed the delay," Mercer said. "I know," she said. "I'll account for variation in the methodology in future engagements. The deviation was deliberate. Someone briefed them to vary their position. That's new information about their command structure." Whitaker said she's doing an after-action assessment from a position she just engaged from. Reed said, "Yes, she is. While we were in here worried about whether she was..." Whitaker stopped. "Yes, sir," Reed said. Whitaker looked at the radio. Then he did something Reed had not seen him do once in the 20 hours he had observed him. He laughed. Not a big laugh, not performance, just a short, genuine sound that came out of him before he could decide whether to allow it. "Captain Carter," he said into the radio, "this is Major Whitaker. For what it's worth, we were concerned about you." A pause from the other end. Then Carter's voice. "I appreciate that, Major. Don't make a habit of it." Whitaker looked at Reed. Reed was already smiling. She came in at 1920, different vehicle than the one that had dropped her off one of Ortega's sent to retrieve her from the extraction point she had designated before going in. The driver was a young corporal who had been told to drive north and stop when he saw a woman with a rifle case, which he had found to be perfectly accurate instructions. She arrived at the main command post looking identical to how she had looked when she left, which Reed noted and thought said something important, though he couldn't have specified exactly what. Redfield was already there. He had returned from the handoff point at some point during the engagement. Reed hadn't seen him arrive, but there he was, standing at the table with Mercer and Whitaker. And when Carter walked in the door, he looked at her the way you look at something you expected and are still relieved to see. 2 engagements, he said, in 24 hours. Less, she said. The second one was faster. Why was it faster, Mercer asked. Because Ortega was listening, she said. He had the pattern before the engagement started. He repositioned before they committed, which meant that when the observer went down and the coordination collapsed, there was no adaptive phase. They moved into a prepared position rather than a responding one. She set the case down. A commander who listens changes the engagement geometry before the shooting starts. That's worth more than any shot I take. Whitaker said, "You're giving him the credit." "I'm distributing it accurately," she said. "You told him what to do." "I told him what to see," she said. "He decided to see it. Those are different things." Whitaker absorbed that. He had his folder again. He'd been writing in it since the engagement started, and the handwriting at the bottom of the page was denser than at the top, the way writing gets when you're working through something, rather than just recording it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "Last night when you arrived, the way I received you," he paused, "was that the first time?" She looked at him steadily. "No." "How often?" "Often enough that I have a standard response to it." "What's the standard response?" "Do the work," she said. "The beginning doesn't rewrite itself, but the end does." Whitaker nodded slowly. The folder was closed in his hands. He wasn't writing anymore. He was holding it the way you hold something you've finished with. "I've been thinking about what you said this morning," he said, "about redirecting the self-recrimination toward understanding what I missed and why." He paused. "I think I missed it because I organized my assessment around what a warrior is supposed to look like, what the profile is, and I didn't consider the possibility that the profile was incomplete." "It's always incomplete," she said. "That's not a flaw in the profile. It's a feature of reality." "That's not a very reassuring position," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it's the honest one." Redfield had been watching this exchange without participating. He looked at Mercer. Mercer looked back. Something passed between them that wasn't words, the kind of communication that happens between two people who have been in enough rooms together that they've developed a shorthand. Then Redfield said, "There's a conversation that needs to happen tonight, all of us, including Reed." He looked at Mercer. "Can you get him?" Mercer sent Garza, the specialist who had somehow become the unofficial liaison between every person in this story, and Garza found Reed at the vehicle perimeter where he had gone after the net came off silence. Reed was sitting on the hood of a Humvee watching the eastern horizon when Garza told him Redfield wanted him in the command post. "What for?" Reed said. "Didn't say, Sergeant." "Did it seem like optional?" Garza considered. "No, Sergeant." Reed got down from the hood. His arm was fine. His shoulder was fine. He had slept 4 hours in the last 32, which was adequate by his accounting. He walked to the command post and went in. Everyone was there. Mercer, Whitaker, Carter, Redfield. The map table had been cleared and there were chairs around it. Not the operational configuration, but something closer to the configuration of people who are about to have a different kind of conversation. Reed took the last chair. Redfield looked around the table. "What happened in the last 24 hours, he said, is part of a pattern that goes beyond this sector, beyond this operation. What I'm about to tell you is classified at a level that doesn't leave this room." He paused. "The enemy coordination we've been tracking across 3 sectors isn't a local commander making good tactical decisions. It's a tested methodology developed over multiple engagements, refined through after-action analysis, specifically designed to exploit the response patterns of standard U.S. infantry units." He let that sit. "We've been on the wrong end of a learning curve." Nobody spoke. "The reason Echo Zero works," Redfield continued, "is not primarily technical. It's that she understands the methodology better than the people running it. She's been inside enough variations of it to see the structure underneath the variation. He looked at Carter. But there's a problem. One person, Carter said. One person, Redfield confirmed. 3 sectors, a unified enemy operational structure, and 1 asset who can read the geometry well enough to intervene decisively. He looked around the table. That is not a sustainable operational picture. Reed said, what does a sustainable picture look like? Redfield looked at him. That's exactly the right question, Sergeant. And the answer to it is why you're all in this room. He reached into the courier case that had been sitting at his feet since his return and produced a folder thicker than the operational order from that afternoon, with a classification marking on the cover that Reed couldn't read from his angle, but that made Mercer sit forward slightly. There is a proposal, Redfield said, at the level above my current posting to formalize what Echo Zero does, to build a structured program around the methodology. Training, selection, deployment. He looked at Carter. You told me yesterday you thought they were wrong. I told you the methodology can't be taught as a standalone program, she said. I stand by that. Then tell me what can be taught, he said. Because we cannot build a future operational posture around a single classified asset who is the only person in the theater who can read this pattern. The room was very quiet. Carter looked at the table, then at Redfield, then slowly around the room at Mercer, at Whitaker, at Reed. The mechanic can be taught, she said. The intervals, the probe pattern signature, the observer geometry, the relationship between comm degradation and push timing. She paused. Ortega learned enough of that in an 8-minute phone call to reposition his element correctly before the engagement started. He's not Echo Zero, but tonight he didn't need to be. Reed said quietly, you're describing a different kind of training. I'm describing pattern literacy, she said. Not the same as what I do, but enough to change the question from, can we survive this engagement, to do we understand what kind of engagement this is before it fully commits? Whitaker said, that's what you gave Ortega. Yes. And what you gave Reed last night on the ridge, the conversation about sequencing, the reason for the observer first. She looked at him, yes. You were teaching, he said, while the engagement was still active. She didn't answer that, but she didn't disagree with it either. Redfield put the folder on the table. There is a proposal in this folder for an embedded advisory structure, not a training program in the formal sense, but a deployment model where operational methodology expertise is integrated at the unit level, rather than called in as a classified asset when there are no other options. He paused. The proposal needs someone to write the operational framework for what that expertise actually consists of. He looked at Carter. I want you to write it. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when a question is asked that changes the shape of the conversation irrevocably, when the thing said cannot be unsaid, and the room has to decide what to do with it. Carter looked at the folder. She did not touch it. That would require me to stop operating, she said. It would require you to change how you operate, Redfield said. Those are different things. She said the same words she had used about Ortega that evening in a different context, and the room felt that echo without anyone naming it. Yes, Redfield said, they are. She looked at Reed. He didn't know why she looked at him. He was the most junior person in the room, the one with the least standing in the conversation. But she looked at him, and he met it, and he thought about what she'd said the night before. I measure an engagement by what it looks like at the end. What does it look like at the end? He said quietly enough that it might have been just for her. She turned back to Redfield. She put her hand on the folder. She did not open it. Not yet, but the hand was on it, and that was its own kind of answer, not complete, not committed, but real. The hand of someone who had just decided that the end of this particular engagement looked different from all the ones before it, and that different did not mean wrong. Redfield saw it. Mercer saw it. Whitaker saw it and looked down at his own folder, the one he had been writing in since the night before, and added one more line at the bottom of the last page. He did not show anyone what he wrote. But Reed, sitting across the table, caught the angle of the pen, and the line he saw Whitaker write was short enough to read from across a table. It said, she was right. The beginning doesn't matter. The geometry does. Carter's hand stayed on the folder for a long time, not opening it, not pulling it toward her, just resting there the way a hand rests on something when the mind above it is working through a calculation that has no clean numerical answer. Everyone at the table understood this, and no one rushed it. Even Redfield, who had a vehicle waiting and a report to file before midnight, sat with the patience of a man who knew that some decisions move at their own pace, regardless of the operational schedule around them. It was Reed who finally broke the silence, and he did it not because he had something tactical to contribute, but because he had been in enough situations where silence became its own kind of pressure, and someone needed to say the thing that was actually in the room. "Can I ask something?" he said. Redfield looked at him. "Go ahead, Sergeant." "The proposal in that folder, the embedded advisory structure." Reed looked at Carter. "Is the resistance about the work itself or about what it means for the work you're already doing?" Carter looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, but in the way that expressions shift when a question lands exactly where the person asking intended it to. "Both," she said. "Then tell me about the second one," Reed said. "Because the first one, the work itself, you already started at it. You briefed Ortega in 8 minutes. You told me about the sequencing on the ridge. You explained the observer geometry to Whitaker this morning." He paused. "You've been doing it the whole time. You just haven't been calling it that." The room was very quiet. Whitaker looked at his folder, then at Carter. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Carter looked down at the folder under her hand. "What I do in the field," she said carefully, "works because there is no institutional weight attached to it. I arrive without a structure around me. I look at the situation without the accumulation of assumptions that builds up when you've been inside a command structure for 6 hours. The reason I can see what the command post can't see is partly skill and partly position. I'm outside the system that's struggling." She paused. "If I become the system, I lose the position." Or, Mercer said quietly, "You change what the system can see." She looked at him. "You said Ortega didn't need to be Echo Zero tonight," Mercer continued. "He needed to know what to look for. That's a different standard, but it's not a low one. And if every element commander in this theater could meet that standard..." He stopped. "What does the engagement look like then?" Carter was silent. "The enemy has been refining their methodology through after-action analysis," Redfield said. "They learn from every engagement. The advantage you have right now, the ability to read their pattern before they know it's been read, has a shelf life. At some point, they will vary the methodology enough that the current pattern is no longer the primary signal." He paused. "When that happens, what's the answer?" "More people who can read patterns," Carter said. "Yes," she opened the folder. "Initial." It was 2100 when the conversation shifted from conceptual to operational, and the shift happened the way significant shifts often do, gradually, and then suddenly the moment Carter turned to page 7 of the proposal and said, "This section is wrong." Redfield leaned forward. "Which part?" "The selection criteria," she said. "They're selecting for technical proficiency, marksmanship scores, tactical problem solving under standard conditions, performance in simulation environments." She looked up. "None of that predicts what you actually need." "What do you actually need?" Whitaker said. "People who are wrong about things and know it," she said. "Not people who are right under test conditions. People who have been wrong in real situations, understood why they were wrong, and built something more accurate from the failure." She looked at the page. "You can't select for that with a test score. You can only find it by looking at what someone did after the moment they were wrong." Reed thought about Torres, 19 years old. 9 weeks deployed, 14 rounds total, sitting beside him in the pocket and saying, "Yeah, I'm ready." Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he had decided that afraid was not the category that mattered in that moment. "How do you write that into a selection criterion?" Mercer said. "You don't write it as a criterion," Carter said. "You write it as a question. For every candidate in the selection process, you ask, find me the moment this person was most wrong and show me what they did next." She paused. "The answer to that question tells you more about operational pattern literacy than any test score." Whitaker was writing. He had stopped trying to pretend he wasn't. "What else is wrong with the proposal?" Redfield said. "The deployment model," she said. "They're proposing embedded advisors as a separate element attached to units but structurally external." "That's wrong. The value that isn't in having a separate person who understands the pattern. The value is in the unit commander understanding the pattern directly." She turned a page. "The advisor's job shouldn't be to see what the commander can't see. It should be to teach the commander to see it themselves and then become unnecessary. Teach yourself out of a job, Reed said. That's the standard, she said. If the commander still needs me, after 6 months I've failed. Redfield sat back. That's a harder sell to the institutional structure. I know, she said, but it's the right one. She looked at him directly. Colonel, you didn't bring this proposal to me for validation. You brought it because you knew the current version was incomplete and you wanted to know what the complete version looked like. That's what it looks like. Redfield held her gaze. It requires the advisor to genuinely transfer the capability rather than maintain dependency. Yes. Most advisory structures don't work that way. I know, she said again. That's why most advisory structures don't produce commanders who can read the engagement on their own. She paused. Ortega needed 8 minutes tonight. Next time he might need 4. After 6 months, he might not need the call at all. She closed the folder. That's what success looks like. At 21:45, Redfield called for a break and stepped outside. Mercer followed. Reed got coffee from the station at the back of the room, real coffee, not the field powder, which someone had produced from a personal supply without explanation, and brought a second cup to Carter, who was still at the table reviewing the proposal. She took it without looking up. Then she did look up. The question you asked earlier, she said, about the resistance. You don't have to, Reed started. I know, she said. I want to answer it correctly. She set the coffee down. For 11 years, the classification around what I do has been protective in 2 directions. It protects the methodology from being read by the wrong people. And it protects me from being weighed against a standard that doesn't fit what I actually do. She paused. If I write this framework and it becomes institutional, both of those protections go away. The methodology is now visible. And I am now accountable to a structure that will judge me by metrics it developed for a different kind of operator. Reed thought about that. And if you don't write it, then the proposal gets written by someone else, she said. Someone who will get the selection criteria wrong and the deployment model wrong and produce advisors who maintain dependency instead of transferring capability. And in 3 years, we'll have an advisory structure that is bureaucratically functional and operationally insufficient. She paused. And more commanders will spend 6 hours inside a funnel they don't recognize before someone calls in an asset they've never heard of. So you write it, Reed said. I write it, she said. Not resignation, just the flat, factual tone of someone arriving at the only answer that survives scrutiny. Reed sat down across from her. He had been standing for most of the last 36 hours, and sitting felt like something he had forgotten he was allowed to do. He held his coffee with both hands and looked at her across the table and said, Can I tell you what I observed over the last 24 hours? Yes, she said. You arrived in a situation where the command structure had failed to read the engagement correctly for 6 hours. You fixed it in 11 minutes. He paused. Then you spent the rest of the time explaining how you fixed it. To Mercer, to Whitaker, to Ortega, to me. He paused again. You didn't have to do that. You fixed the problem. You could have packed up and left. She said nothing. You explained it because you wanted people to be able to see it themselves next time, he said. That's not the behavior of someone who wants to protect their position. That's the behavior of someone who actually believes the goal is for the situation to be better, not for them to be necessary to it. He looked at her. You've already made the decision. You just haven't signed the folder yet. Carter looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the coffee. She drank it. She set it down. You'd make a good officer, she said. I've been told, he said. I like being a sergeant. Why not I am? Because sergeants see the thing directly, he said. Officers see it through the structure. Sometimes the structure helps. Sometimes it's the thing in the way. She looked at him. That's going into the selection criteria. Good, Asham, he said. Redfield came back in at 22:10, and he came in with something that changed the shape of the room immediately, not his expression, which was controlled, but the way he was holding himself. The specific posture of a man who has just received information and is deciding how to release it. He sat down. He looked at Carter. The third sector, he said. Everyone went still. The Western operation, the one we haven't discussed because the intelligence picture was incomplete. He put a new document on the table. It became complete 40 minutes ago. There is a third coordinated engagement building in the Western sector. Same probe pattern, same interval structure, same methodology. He paused. They didn't stop when we neutralized the ridge last night. They didn't stop when the Eastern sector collapsed tonight. They are running 3 simultaneous operations as a test of scale. The question they're asking is whether our response to one sector depletes our capacity to respond to the others. The room absorbed that. How long before the Western sector commits? Mercer said. Estimated 4 to 6 hours, Redfield said. Maybe less if they accelerate the pattern based on what happened in the Eastern sector tonight. They'll know the Eastern sector failed, Whitaker said. They'll adjust. They'll know the Eastern sector failed, Carter said. They won't know why. The observer going down mid-engagement looks like a lucky shot from their position. The machine gun repositioning looks like Ortega's independent decision. She paused. They don't know the pattern was read before the engagement started. They don't know about the 8-minute call, which means they'll run the same methodology in the Western sector, Reed said. Yes, she said, with one modification. They now know their observer position is a vulnerability. They'll vary at same role, different location. Further back, more concealed, possibly with a secondary relay. She looked at the document. The Western sector terrain, Redfield produced a map. She studied it for 90 seconds. The relay, she said, they'll use a relay observer, primary observer further back, secondary closer in to transmit. It's a response to losing the observer in 2 engagements. They're learning. She looked up. So am I. Can you work with it? Redfield said. I need the Western sector's radio traffic for the last 8 hours, she said, and I need the name and number of the element commander. Captain Yates, Redfield said. She's been in position for 7 days. Good instincts, solid team. Carter looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at Whitaker. Whitaker was already reaching for the communication station. I'll get her on the line, Whitaker said. Tell her the same thing you told Ortega, Carter said. Don't brief her on me. Brief her on the pattern, what she needs to be able to see, not who's going to help her see it. Whitaker paused. Why? Because she needs to trust the information, not the source, Carter said. If she's waiting for Echo Zero, she's outsourcing the judgment. If she understands the pattern, she owns the judgment. She paused. That's the difference. Whitaker nodded. He got Yates on the line and he briefed her the way Carter said pattern: first methodology, second the observer, relay adjustment. Third, he spoke for 6 minutes without interruption, and when he finished, Yates asked 2 questions that were precisely the right questions, and Whitaker looked at Carter when he heard them, and Carter nodded once. She's got it, Carter said quietly. From a 6-minute brief, Reed said. 6 minutes with the right information is worth 6 hours without it, she said. Sierra. At 2300, the Western sector probe intervals came in through the feed that Wiley had been running continuously. Reed was watching them before anyone asked him to. 4 minutes, he said. First interval is 4 minutes. Carter was already at the communication station. Yates, she said, it's starting. What do you see? Yates's voice from the Western sector was the voice of a commander who had just seen the things she'd been told to watch for and was experiencing the specific clarity that comes from a prediction confirming itself in real time. 4-minute interval. Northeast probe withdrawal consistent with the briefed pattern. We're in it. Yes, Carter said. Get your element redistributed now before communications degrade. Southern approach is your primary concern based on the terrain. Your observer relay will be, she looked at the map for 1 second, north-northwest 2-tier position, primary further back than you expect. Don't look for the closest elevated point. Look for the second one. Second elevated point north-northwest, Yates said. Copy. And Captain, yes. When you see it, trust it. Don't wait for confirmation. A pause. Understood, Yates said. We're moving. The net went semi-quiet, not the full silence of the night before, because Carter was managing 3 simultaneous information flows: the Western sector feed the relay through Mercer's command post and her own assessment of the engagement geometry. She was not in the field this time. She was doing from a chair in a command post what she normally did from a compromised tower or an Eastern approach, reading the pattern and making the pattern knowable to the person who needed to act on it. Reed watched her do it and thought, this is what it looks like when the advisor structure works correctly. Not a separate person with a separate capability inserted when there are no other options. A presence that changes what the person in the fight can see. At 23:22, Yates reported, I have eyes on a position north-northwest. Second elevation. One element observer role relay setup confirmed. They have a second position further back I can't engage directly from here. You don't need to, Carter said immediately. The relay position is the critical link. Take the relay and the primary observer loses real-time transmission. They can still see, but they can't communicate what they see in time to be actionable. She paused. What's your best engagement angle on the relay? Southeast Ridge, Yates said. I've got a sniper team positioned there already. Distance, 480 meters. Clean shot? Clean, Yates said. And take it, Carter said. And tell your team after the relay goes down, the ground elements will hesitate. They've lost their eyes. That hesitation is your window to reposition your southern approach coverage. 30 seconds, maybe less. 30 seconds, Yates said. Moving now. The room was completely still. Reed realized he was holding his breath and released it deliberately. Beside him, Torres, who had followed Reed into the command post at some point without anyone noticing, because Torres had developed the habit of being where Reed was watching the communication station with the expression of a 19-year-old who was understanding something for the first time that he would spend the rest of his career building on. At 23:29, a single shot rang out over the western sector feed. A sniper report, not a .50 caliber, a different system, but with the same quality of deliberateness that Reed had learned to recognize. One shot, specific, not reactive. Then Yates's voice, relay is down, repositioning southern coverage now. 28 seconds of noise from the feed movement orders, in low voices the sound of a unit that knew what it was doing and was doing it fast. Then southern coverage edge in position. Hostile ground elements are stationary. They've stopped moving. Carter said, they lost the picture. They don't know what changed. Give them 60 seconds before they decide to push anyway. 40 seconds later, Yates said, they're withdrawing, northeast, not a committed withdrawal. They're confused. They don't have eyes and they know it. Let them go, Carter said. Don't pursue. Consolidate your position and watch the primary observer. We're watching, Yates said. Another 20 seconds, then primary observer is moving, also withdrawing. Carter sat back. The western sector was over. No element of the enemy's coordinated three-sector operation had produced the outcome it was designed to produce. All three engagements had failed at the point where the methodology was supposed to be most effective, the moment when coordinated observation and timing were supposed to give the enemy the initiative. All three times the initiative had been taken from them before they could fully exercise it. At 23:41, Yates came back on the line. Her voice had the quality that voices get after something goes better than it had any right to go. Command, she said. Western sector stable. No friendly casualties. What just happened? Mercer looked at Carter. Carter looked at the radio. Captain Yates, she said, your sniper team performed the relay shot. Your element repositioned correctly. You read the pattern and acted on it before it fully committed. She paused. That's what happened. A silence from the western sector. Then Yates said, I had a very good briefing. You acted on it, Carter said. The briefing is just information. The action was yours. Redfield looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at Whitaker. Whitaker looked at the folder. Not his folder, Carter's folder, the proposal sitting on the table where she had left it after the break. He reached across the table and slid it toward her without a word. She looked at it. She looked at Reed. He said nothing. He didn't have to. She picked up a pen. She opened to the executive summary, the first page, the one that would be read by people above Redfield's, posting the people who would decide whether this proposal became policy or became another classified document in a file that no one with the right clearance ever got around to reading. She started writing, not filling in blanks, not editing existing language, starting over from the first line in the handwriting that Reed had seen before, fast and precise, the handwriting of someone who has written field documents under time pressure so many times that speed and clarity have become the same thing. The room stayed quiet. No one asked what she was writing. They would see it when she was done. Redfield poured himself coffee. He stood at the back of the room and drank it and watched her write with the expression of a man who has been trying to solve a problem for a long time and has just watched it begin to solve itself. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. At the 40-minute mark, she set the pen down, turned to page 1 and read it through once. She made 2 small corrections. Then she closed the folder and set it on the table. "It's incomplete," she said. "The tactical detail in sections 4 and 5 needs another day. But the framework is right. The selection criteria, the deployment model, the success metrics." She looked at Redfield. "The success metric is the most important part. I want it read carefully." Redfield picked up the folder. He turned to the success metrics section and read. His face changed not dramatically, but in the specific way it changed when he encountered something that was more precise than he had anticipated. He read it aloud. "Operational success is defined not by the advisor's performance in any given engagement, but by the measurable reduction in the unit's reliance on advisory intervention over time. The endpoint of a successful advisory relationship is a unit commander who no longer requires the advisor to see the pattern, only to confirm what they have already seen." The room sat with that. Torres, standing near the back, said quietly to Reed, "That means she's trying to make sure nobody ever needs to call Echo Zero again." "Not like they called her yesterday," Reed said. "Not at the last minute with no other options." He paused. "That's the whole point." Torres thought about that for a moment. "That's kind of..." "Yeah," Reed said. Whitaker was reading over Redfield's shoulder. He reached the second paragraph of the success metrics and stopped. He read it again. "Captain Carter," he said. She looked at him. "The second paragraph. The note about initial advisory deployment." He read from the page, "The first deployment of an advisor to any unit should not be initiated at a moment of crisis. A unit receiving their first exposure to operational pattern literacy during an active engagement is a unit that has been failed by the structure that should have prepared them. Advisors deployed under crisis conditions are not demonstrating the success of the program. They are demonstrating its absence." The room was completely quiet. Whitaker set the folder down. He looked at Carter with an expression that had traveled a very long way from the expression he'd worn when her Humvee arrived 24 hours ago. "You wrote that for yesterday," he said. "I wrote it for every yesterday," she said, "and for every one that hasn't happened yet." He nodded slowly. He picked up his own folder, the one he'd been writing in since the beginning, the one that had started as a professional record and had become something more personal and considerably more honest. He held it for a moment, then he set it on the table beside hers. "I'd like to contribute to the tactical detail," he said. "Sections 4 and 5, the command post perspective, what the engagement looks like from inside the structure that's struggling." He paused. "I have first-hand experience." Carter looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, that's exactly what it needs." Mercer looked at Reed. Reed looked at Torres. Torres looked like someone who had come in looking for a sergeant and had ended up witnessing something he was going to spend the rest of his career thinking about. "Sergeant Reed," Mercer said, "is there something you'd like to contribute?" Reed thought about it. He thought about the pocket and the 14 rounds and the 4-minute intervals and the shot from the tower that landed like an answer to a question the enemy hadn't known they'd asked. "I'd like to write the section on what the engagement looks like from inside the funnel," he said. "Before anyone understands it's a funnel." He paused. "So the next generation of squad leaders knows what they're looking at before it's 6 hours in." Mercer nodded. "Write it." Just at 0100, Redfield prepared to leave. He stood at the door of the command post with the folder under his arm. Carter's rewritten proposal. Whitaker's tactical addendum already drafted in outline form. Reed's section committed to the process, if not yet to paper. He looked at the room the way you look at a room where something real has happened, and you want to hold the shape of it for a moment before you leave. He looked at Carter last. "The third round," he said, "it had become in the last 30 hours a kind of shorthand between them, the round from November that she still had the standard it represented." "Still have it," she said. After tonight, it's even easier to keep," she said. "The engagement in the Western sector didn't need me in the field. It needed Yates to understand what she was seeing." She paused. "That's the standard I'm aiming for. Every sector, every commander, every engagement, a situation where the shot never needs to be mine because the person in the field already has the picture." Redfield looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "That's a higher standard than being the best shot in the theater." "Yes," she said, "it is." He walked out. The vehicle started. The sound of it pulled away and faded, and the command post settled back into the quiet of 0100, the particular quiet of a base that has been through something and is finding its footing in the aftermath. Mercer sat down. Whitaker sat across from him. Reed was at the communications station with Torres, reviewing the Western Sector feed one final time. Carter was at the table with the folder, adding a note in the margin of Section 3 that had occurred to her in the last few minutes. It was ordinary in the way that the moments after extraordinary things are always ordinary people in a room doing the next thing, carrying the weight of what they'd been through, without talking about it directly because there wasn't language yet for the specific thing it had been. Torres said to Reed quietly, "She's not going to stop. Is she going into the field?" "No," Reed said, "but she's going to change what it means." "How?" Reed thought about the 8-minute call to Ortega, the 6-minute brief to Yates, the 40 minutes of writing that had produced a framework for something that had never existed before in exactly this form. He thought about what she had said about teaching yourself out of a job. "She's going to make the field smaller," he said. "The places where someone has to go in alone and read it all by themselves. She's going to make that territory smaller, one commander at a time, until the only situations that need Echo Zero are the ones nobody has ever seen before." Torres thought about that for a while. What happens to her when all the situations have been seen before? Reed looked across the room at Carter, writing in the margin, unhurried, precise, the rifle case propped against the table beside her. "She'll be on to the next one," he said. "The situations nobody has seen yet. That's where she lives." Torres nodded slowly. "That's a lonely place to live." "Yes," Reed said. "It is." He paused. "But it's not an empty one." At 0200, Carter finished the margin note, closed the folder, and stood. She picked up the rifle case. Everyone in the room looked at her. "I'll have the complete draft of sections 4 and 5 to Whitaker by end of week," she said. "The framework holds. The rest is detail." She looked at Mercer. "Your platoon performed correctly last night. Reed called the herding pattern early enough that the intervention was possible. Put that in the record." "I will," Mercer said. She looked at Whitaker. He met it without flinching. A different man in a crucial way from the one who had grabbed the radio and laughed 26 hours ago. Not unrecognizable, just corrected. Rebuilt around a more accurate picture. "Section 4, she said. "Write it honestly. What you thought when you saw me get out of the Humvee. What you said on the radio, all of it." She paused. "Because the officers who read this proposal need to understand that the instinct to dismiss isn't a character flaw. It's a structural habit built by a system that has taught them a specific picture of what competence looks like. You can't fix the habit by shaming it. You fix it by replacing the picture." Whitaker said, "I'll write it honestly." "Good," she said. She looked at Reed last. He had stood up from the communications station when she stood. He was holding his coffee cup with both hands the way he'd held it during their conversation earlier, the posture of someone who is fully present without performing presence. "Sergeant Reed," she said. "Captain," he said. "The section on the funnel. Write it from Torres's perspective, not yours. What a 19-year-old soldier with 14 rounds sees and feels and decides in the last hour of a 6-hour engagement." She paused. "That's the perspective that needs to be in this document, not the experienced sergeant who called the pattern. The new soldier who didn't know what pattern meant and held anyway." Reed looked at Torres. Torres looked back with the expression of someone who has just been told that the thing he went through matters in a way he hadn't expected. "I'll write it from his perspective," Reed said. "I'll ask him to review it." Carter nodded. She picked up the rifle case and walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. She did not look back, not because she was being dramatic, but because looking back was genuinely not part of how she moved through the world. She had said what she needed to say. The work was started. The rest was execution. She walked out. The door stayed open behind her. The desert night was quiet in the way deserts are quiet, completely without apology, without the softening sounds of water or wind or anything that makes quietness easier to be inside. Under that quiet, a base was consolidating. Squads were debriefing a Western sector. Element was building a picture of a pattern they now understood. And somewhere in the corridor between 3 failed enemy operations and a proposal that would spend the next 6 months becoming policy, the shape of something new was becoming visible. Not a legend, not a myth, not the story of a woman who arrived from nowhere and ended a firefight in 11 minutes, though that story would be told and it would be accurate as far as it went. Something more durable than a story, a method, a framework, a set of questions asked in the right order of the right people. What did the engagement actually require? What did the commander actually see? What would they need to have seen in the first 3 minutes to change everything that came after? Reed stood at the open door and listened to the quiet for a moment. Behind him, Torres was writing something on a notepad, not the formal section. Just notes, first impressions, the things you write down before you know how you're going to use them. Whitaker was at the table with his folder open, writing in that tight, precise hand, starting from the beginning, starting with the laugh. Mercer was on the radio with Ortega, then with Yates walking through what they'd seen and what it meant and how they'd use it. And somewhere out in the desert under the dark and the quiet, a woman with a rifle case and one round she intended to keep forever was already thinking about the next engagement, not to be in it, but to make sure the commander who would face it was already asking the right questions before it started. They had asked for a real warrior. What they got was the person who decided that the truest measure of a warrior is not how many fights they can win alone, but how many they can make unnecessary.